Today we'll be talking about a critical aspect of Begin's legacy, what has come to be known as the Begging Doctrine, a sort of unofficial article of faith which states that no country which is committed or has committed itself to the destruction of Israel will be permitted to acquire the means to carry that out. And that all started with Menachem Begin's fateful decision to bomb and destroy the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981. So we have two fantastic and very well-equipped speakers to discuss this issue with us today. Our first speaker will talk about the event itself. In 1981, Menachem Begin's motivations for his decision, and our second speaker will talk about the implementation of the Begging Doctrine some 26 years later by a future Israeli Prime Minister and government. So our first speaker then is Herzl Makov, the CEO of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and my boss. So just to sort of set the scene for those maybe less familiar with the period, we're talking about a time when Saddam Hussein's Iraq was, Saddam Hussein used to talk about Israel the way we now think of Iran talking about Israel, right? He was talked about drowning Israel in rivers of blood and all this sort of, this very sort of gaudy language that that sort of Arab leaders tend to use when talking about destroying Israel. As someone who obviously leads this institution, the Begin Heritage Center, and someone who has really for so many years been a devotee and a student of Menachem Begin, how do you think about Begin's decision to attack the reactor? What were his motivations?
Paul, as you good evening, and it's very nice to meet you in this kind of setup, and all of our guests as well. As you said briefly about Menachem Begin doctrine, in a way that sum up the motivation, and I would just add another sentence to this doctrine. I mean, it was very simple. As you said, in one sentence, he defines the doctrine of the security of Israel, that we, under no circumstances, will not allow the enemy of the Jewish people to acquire an ammunition of mass destruction. And if you want to say it in two words, never again. That was where he's coming from. But there was another statement by Menachem Begin when he said that when the enemy of our people announced that he's going to destroy us or hurt us, we have to take them seriously and act in order to prevent him or them from doing it. And if you take those two sentences, you understand that the decision in principle was very easy to him. It was very natural to go and to destroy after, we have to remember that, after all the diplomatic efforts failed. Saddam Hussein started his effort to acquire a nuclear reactor in mid-70s. And until 79, 80, there were diplomatic efforts towards France, Italy, Germany, that they were and Brazil, that the main supplier was France, but the other three countries supplied some elements that enable Saddam Hussein to upgrade the project to a military project, not only a civilian project, as France said that was their intention, just to supply a civil project. So Menachem Begin came to the conclusion that there is no other option. We are not going to allow again Jewish children to be under the threat of mass destruction. But if you go beyond that, you understand now that if we haven't done it, if we would let him acquire, the whole Middle East would be a different Middle East that we know today, because if that was the case, for sure, immediately Saudi Arabia, Egypt, because always there was a competition in the Arabic world between Egypt and Iraq, for example, on the leadership of the Arabic world. So we would come to a nuclear race in the region, which of course would be a threat to Israel, but it would be a threat to the whole region and to the whole world.
Right, which is also, of course, one of the issues that comes up today when we talk about Iran. So
exactly.
Well, I mean, this motivation. I mean, I think that's really powerful. I think with when you refer to the two word version of the explanation, never again, because clearly the Holocaust had this massive impact on Begin. And
there was other statement of Begin. His assistant told me that they were driving in the street of Jerusalem, and they saw a bunch of young children playing in a playground. And he said to him, Menachem Begin said to him, can I ignore the future of all the Sarlach and Mendelach and Menachemlech? He used the Yiddish term because the most of the Holocaust victims were, of course, Yiddish speakers. Can I ignore them? Can I not do something to prevent them from having such a future?
Right, and and this was, I think any biography of Begin that sort of has to do justice to him, I think has to focus on the impact that the Holocaust had on his thinking. The international reaction was very harsh, right, to the decision, including from the United States. Yeah.
Well, of course, some of them had the vested interest in that.
Right.
France, I mean, they in a way, before we attacked there, the Iranian tried to attack this reactor twice. It was the time when they had the Iran-Iraq war.
Right.
When Saddam Hussein he thought that there is a new regime in Iran. Khomeini just took power in 79. So he thought Saddam, it's a good opportunity. The Iranian told him differently, or taught him differently. It wasn't easy. By the way, when Menachem Begin was asked about this war between Iran and Iraq, he said, I wish success to both sides. So they tried twice. So most of the French technicians weren't on site because they were afraid from another attack from Iran. But the Iranian missed the target and didn't do any harm. So of course the Arabic world were against, and very loudly, and the UN of course were against it. And even as you said, in the Reagan administration, elements that were not happy with Israel to start with, like the Vice President Bush and the Defense Secretary Weinberger, they took opportunity to say that Israel did coordinate. Israel, we understood that we have a green light to do what we think we should do, but we didn't coordinate for sure with them. But what is interesting is that a couple of months later, McFarlane, the National Security Advisor to President Reagan, came to Israel, and he met with the Prime Minister, Begin, and towards the end of the meeting, he said, Mr. Prime Minister, I have a special personal message from the president. So Begin said, sure, go ahead. He said, no, I have to do it in private. There were two aides of Menachem Begin in the room. So Menachem Begin said, those people I trust, like it's myself. And if you can't say it in their presence, you don't have to say it. So McFarlane thought for a second and said, okay, the president said, well done.
Interesting. And then, of course, 10 years later, when the US is trying to get Iraq out of Kuwait, there's that famous, I think Dick Cheney, who was then Defense Secretary, writes a letter to David Ivry, who had been head of the Air Force in 1981, saying thank you very much for preventing Saddam going nuclear. He wrote, for doing our job much more easier. Right.
And he wrote it as a dictation on a big picture of the ruins of the reactor.
Nice. Let me ask you also, because you, as I said in my introduction, you were part of the squadron involved in the operation. What can you tell us about the operation itself? Is it true that the mission was so top secret that even the pilots didn't know until the last minute where they were going?
Not the last minute, but during the preparation, they haven't been told the mission. And in the beginning, they were told, I wasn't on a fighter plane. I was on an early warning and control aeroplane. But the fighter, because when they had to do the model and to do all the training, they have been told that they have to attack and target in a radius of 1,000 kilometers. It was like 600 nautical miles. So of course they took the radius and saw around Israel what kind of targets, and some of them already figure what they are talking about. Then they have been told that they are going to attack an airport in Iraq, Khabaniya. But quite a few months before, and you have to remember that due to some circumstances, we had to delay the operation twice. It was supposed to be in April, then in May, and then at the end we did it on June.
Okay. Yeah, it's I can only imagine the extraordinary nature of the operation itself. And was it delayed partly because it was there was concern that it was being leaked? I think Shimon Peres was leader of the opposition, and he found out about it before Begin wanted to find out about it. Or there was definitely some internal political stuff going on, right?
No, Begin informed and update Shimon Peres and Rabin, as Shimon Peres as the head of the opposition. Rabin is part of the opposition, but prime minister. In the past, he told them about. Of course, they knew that because the reactor was built during the term of Rabin and Peres as Minister of Defense, and it was one of the things that during the transition, Rabin told Begin about it. But when there was a decision to attack, Begin updated them, but he didn't tell them the date. The first time that it was delayed was because of weather. There were clouds over Baghdad, over Iraq, and we at that time we didn't have what we called, sophisticated bombs. It was you had to have an eye contact with the target, and if there are clouds, of course there is no eye contact. So it was delayed once because of that, and the second time, on the day that we were supposed to take off, actually some of the plane were already on the runway. Begin got a letter from Shimon Peres urging him not to do the operation because it's going to have a consequence that we won't be able to observe, and the whole world, and so and so, and Israel will become a desert. He used terms from the Bible. So Begin became concerned. He said, not because he thought that Peres is going to call Saddam Hussein, but if Peres heard it, who knows who else heard it? And of course, to send 8 airplanes to Iraq, it's about 1,000 kilometers away from Israel. It was a very risky mission. If God forbid something happened, and you have to send a helicopter to rescue, it will take the helicopter 3 hours just to get there. To the fighter airplane, it took almost an hour flight. So a helicopter, of course, it was very risky mission. Thank God we came out of it with no injuries at all. But Begin was worried. So we canceled at the last minute because of the leak to Shimon Peres. Huh. Nowadays, we know how the leak happened, by the way.
Okay. My last question for you. As well as opposition from Shimon Peres, who was in the opposition, was it also difficult for Begin to persuade members of his cabinet? Because Begin was famously, he always saw himself as first among equals. He believed in cabinet decision making, that he was a prime minister, not a president. Did he have to convince people? Because I imagine there would have been concerns about, amongst other things, that it might affect the peace with Egypt.
Yeah, Begin in that case wanted to get to a consensus, not only to a majority in the government, in the cabinet.
Wow.
He had immediately a majority, but 2 senior members of the cabinet, which represent other parties than Begin party, it was Yigal Yadin from the Democratic Movement, and he was chief of staff of Israel during the Independence War, and Yosef Burg from the Religious Party. They were reluctant, mainly because of the risks and because of the implementation of the peace treaty with Egypt, as you said, and maybe other considerations. So Begin made a very thorough process of decision-making with the government. For example, he brought to the cabinet meeting all the heads of the intelligence branches. And he let those who were in favor and those who were against. And there was even opposition in the intelligence community as well. The head of the intelligence in the army was against. His number 2 was very much for the attack, for the operation. And Begin brought both of them to the cabinet meeting. And then after he saw that Minister Yadin and Minister Burg are against, he sent the Chief of Staff, Raful, and the commander of the Air Force, General David Ivry, to a private meeting with them to convince them. And he got a consensus towards the end.
Wow, that's no small thing in an Israeli coalition.
And imagine it was kept secret.
Wow. Okay, thank you very much, Herzl Makov. So we'll definitely hear more from you when we get to questions. And I'm going to turn now to Jakob Katz, our second speaker, who is editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and author of Shadow Strike: Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power. Welcome, Jakob. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
So as well as obviously the Begging Doctrine being so relevant, very relevant for the topic that you wrote about in Shadow Strike, another connection that I found was Dick Cheney, who I mentioned before in the context of thanking Israel for destroying Iraq's reactor. He also wrote on the back of your book, at least in the copy that I have, after serving as vice president to George Bush, that the book is a blueprint for how countries can and should act when faced with a threat of an existential nature, which I think is a nice allusion to the Begging Doctrine in many ways. So this happens in 2007. I believe is it March 2007?
September
2007. March 2007, I think, is when they
It's pretty much March is when Israel discovers that something is happening in Syria. When they get those initial pieces of intelligence that are basically the smoking gun that Bashar al-Assad is building a nuclear reactor in northeastern Syria.
Okay, and 7 months prior to that, Israel had been in the Second Lebanon War. Ehud Olmert was very much a sort of under pressure prime minister. The war was regarded as a failure. His reputation was being battered by the public, and he had legal problems as well, criminal investigations. So can you set the scene for us that this is, I know from reading the book, I know the research that you did included also a lot of time spent talking to Ehud Olmert himself. Can you set the scene for us? What was going on in the Prime Minister's office when this bombshell?
So first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you all on the Yortzeit, I guess, of Menachem Begin 29 years ago, and to talk about really such an important topic, and also to remember Menachem Begin at a time when we in Israel are again in our fourth round of elections in the span of 2 years, and to recall once upon a time different leaders that this country once had. But we'll put that aside for a moment. I'll be happy to set the scene, but just before that, you mentioned Dick Cheney, who, as Herzl mentioned before, played a role as the Secretary of Defense, and I've actually been in David Ivry's office and seen that photo of the bombed out reactor with the inscription from Dick Cheney. But Ivry also played a role in 2007, because when Ehud Olmert had to come to the decision of what to do, he had to think back, who's done this before, right? And really in the whole world, there was only one commander of an air force that had ever bombed a nuclear reactor in another country, and that was David Ivry. So David Ivry ended up participating also and in those discussions that the prime minister convened every once in a while. And of course, there was Dick Cheney, who at the time in 2007 was the vice president of George W. Bush. But just to set the scene, we're talking about March 2007. Israel is 7 months after a bad war in Lebanon, a war that ends, which now we have the retrospect of over 14 years, where we can look back and say, actually this created a quiet. Yes, Hezbollah has now built up a formidable force that it did not previously have, but we have had almost 15 years of unprecedented quiet along the border with Lebanon as a result of that war. But back then it was a war with 122 soldiers who were killed, 2 of them still being held as captives at the time by Hezbollah, over 60 civilians killed. and 4,300 rockets that had pounded Haifa, northern Israel, had been turned into a ghost town. Israel at the time not having Iron Dome. Israel was battered, and the war ends. And there are demonstrations outside the prime minister's office calling for Prime Minister Olmert to step down. At the same time, the prime minister, similar to some extent to what we have today, is under investigation, numerous investigations, which we all know culminate in the prime minister's resignation, his indictment, his conviction, and he ends up getting sentenced to jail and serves a 2-year plus, almost 2 years, I think, sentence in Masyau prison near Ramla. But in March, Israel had these suspicions that something was happening in the nuclear realm in Syria, but it couldn't put its finger on it. And it was a joint effort of military intelligence, was known as Agaf HaModi'in, the military intelligence division of the IDF, together with the Mossad. And it was unclear. We knew, for example, that Syria had a nuclear reactor, which had purchased from the Chinese back in the 1990s, had a staff of maybe just about a dozen people. But nothing of the capacity to be able to create a weapons program. And Israel would follow that, but there was something happening. There were connections with North Korea, there were connections with Pakistan. There was something that was happening, but they couldn't put their finger on it. And in March, Ibrahim Otman, who was the Syrian head of the Atomic Energy Commission in Syria, a well-known nuclear scientist, physicist, was traveling to Vienna, which is the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, for just regular meetings. And the head of military intelligence, Amos Yadlin, at the time in 2007, who back in Herzl's time in 1981 was actually one of the pilots of the F-16s that bombed the Osirak reactor outside of Baghdad. Fast forward to 2007, he now is the head of military intelligence, and he goes to Meir Dagan, who was at the time the head of the Mossad, and says, I want to send agents to track Ibrahim Otman and to see if we can gather some intelligence from him while he's in Vienna. Dagan was actually a bit resistant because in the past, the Mossad had tracked Otman around the world. They had pickpocketed, that basically looked in his pocket, looked in his briefcase, looked in his hotel room. They always came back empty-handed. They thought it would be a waste of time. And anyhow, for Dagan, Iran was the primary issue. And the thought of a nuclear program in Syria in our own backyard was just delusional, right? I mean, we didn't know about it. But in the end, he convinced him. He said, look, do it for me. If nothing comes of it, we'll put it to rest, but you never know. So the Mossad agents go there, and actually the night of that operation in Vienna, there was actually another Mossad operation that was going on in another part of Europe. And this one in Vienna was considered to be really just nothing of importance. But that night, they hit a jackpot. And Otman had left his laptop computer in his hotel room, and the Mossad agents were able to download the contents of his computer and bring them back to Israel. But just to give you a sense, Paul, of how they thought they wouldn't find anything, as they bring this flash drive back to Tel Aviv, the Mossad gives it to the military intelligence guys, and they put it on a shelf for about 2 weeks, and they don't even look at it. And then 2 weeks go by, and someone one day says, hey, whatever happened to that flash drive, right, with the stuff from the Vienna operation? And they download it, and they're blown away. Because on Otman's computer were pictures of a nuclear reactor being built in northeastern Syria. They could see the structure of the reactor, the fuel rods, the core of the reactor, and the kicker was a picture of Otman posing in front of the reactor, the building which was going to house the reactor, together with a man who was wearing a blue tracksuit who was of Asian ethnicity. And the Israeli intelligence folks were, who is this Asian guy? And they go through their database and they discover that this was Chon Chibu. Chon Chibu is the head of the Yongbyon nuclear complex in North Korea. So not only are we talking about a nuclear reactor being built literally in Israel's backyard, not 1,000 kilometers away like in the case of Osirak, but also being built for Syria by one of the greatest threats to the world, North Korea. You mentioned before Prime Minister Olmert's investigation. So Dagan brings this intelligence to Ehud Olmert, lays out the photos on the desk at the Prime Minister's office, starts describing what they're seeing. There's a knock at the door. And Olmert says, go away, but the knocking persists. The meeting that took place that day at about 6:30 in the evening. So that's close to our 8 p.m. News, right? Everyone knows in Israel, 8 p.m. is the big news show. And opens the door, Olmert's spokesperson, and says, then it was Channel 2, now it's Channel 12. Channel 2 is going to broadcast a story of how there's another investigation against you, right? So, I mean, just imagine the scene for a moment. Here you are, the Prime Minister of Israel. You've just received intelligence that literally changes the world for you. One of your enemies is developing a weapon that has the capability to pose a threat to you. And at that same time, there's a knock on the door telling you that you have another report against you. This was the scene going into this whole episode.
It's extraordinary, and I in commending your book to our viewers, it's told, it really reads like a thriller. One of the differences, or one of the compelling aspects of your book, is what it reveals about the U.S.-Israel relationship, I think, because especially when you have, as you had then, a U.S. administration and an Israeli government that really did have a high level of mutual trust and mutual respect, the Olmert government and the Bush administration. And as we heard earlier, in 1981, Israel wasn't coordinating things with the U.S., and there was opposition from within the administration, although in the end, it turned out Reagan did sort of quietly approve of what Israel had done. But in this occasion, can you tell us something about, because there's some extraordinary scenes told in the book. Can you just tell us something about how Bush and his senior advisors reacted first to the news of the intelligence, this bombshell of the intelligence that Mayor Dagan brought to Washington, and then how they reacted to Olmert's decision to strike?
Right. Well, if we compare again to 1981, there was a stark difference in 2007. And Herzl spoke about this earlier, was that Israel, this was a huge secret, right? No one knew of Israeli plans back in 1981 to bomb the Osirak reactor. Definitely, it wasn't something that was shared with the Americans. And that's why Israel was condemned at the time, right? There was a UN Security Council resolution against Israel. Reagan, who privately expressed his support for it, postponed the delivery of fighter jets to Israel at the time in response to the strike that Begin carried out. In 2007, Olmert decided very early on to bring the intelligence to the United States. And you mentioned Dagan comes to Washington, meets with the head of the National Security Council at the time was Steve Hadley, meets with Dick Cheney, meets with the head of the CIA, and basically gives them this information. They're blown away, but they immediately embark on their own process to validate and verify the information, and also start to think up what are their options, right? This is not just a problem for Israel, obviously. It's a problem also for the global community, for the world. And just like Israel created a bunch of different options, so did the Bush administration. But we'll skip over that part for a moment. What I think Olmert was trying to do at the time was he had really two ambitions or motivations to get to bring this, when bringing this to the Americans. The first was because of, as you mentioned, we were just 7 months after a bad war in Lebanon. And that was against a Hezbollah. Hezbollah at the time, not like it is today, a small guerrilla organization with maybe 15,000 rockets. Syria, this is Syria pre-civil war. This is Syria with a very large military, a formidable military, stockpiles of biological and chemical weapons, hundreds of Scud missiles capable of striking anywhere inside the state of Israel, right? More tanks than we have, more soldiers than we have. We have aerial superiority. Hopefully we would have won, God forbid, a war against them. But the last big conventional military that still posed a threat to Israel, a war with Syria that could break out after an Israeli strike against a nuclear reactor in Syria, would be nothing compared to the war that had taken place in the summer of 2006. Olmert wanted to try to avoid that, and an American strike against the reactor might see retaliation against Israel, but not at the same scale. So that was motivation one. Motivation two was that we're the usual suspect. if Israel attacks the nuclear reactor, it's, expected. We discovered it. It was a top secret. No one knew about it. Assad kept it a secret, even from some of his closest advisors at the time. But if Israel attacks, that's very much expected. If America attacks, the message that would then be sent to Iran, which everyone at the time viewed as the greatest threat with their pursuit of a nuclear capability, would be far stronger and create such a greater deterrent for the Ayatollahs as they try to continue to pursue a nuclear weapon. Those were his two motivations. That's important to keep in mind. But eventually, when Israel, and there's a lot of discussions that go back and forth, but Bush decides to take his time to consider his options. In July of 2007, after a few months of deliberations and debates within the administration of what to do, Cheney, by the way, was a big proponent of the U.S. attacking. He was the lone voice within the administration. Condoleezza Rice was opposed to it. Bob Gates was opposed to it. The intelligence community was very hesitant, and this was because they had been burned in 2001. In 2003, when they go to war against Iraq, against Saddam Hussein, on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, which were never discovered, and to now go to attack another Arab Muslim country because of intelligence provided from a third party, aka the Jewish state of Israel, might not have looked good for the Bush administration in his second term in office. So this was a big concern for them. But so Bush ultimately debates the issue. July of 2007, I think it was a Friday, July 13th, if I recall correctly, calls up Ehud Olmert and says to him, I've decided I'm not going to attack. I have a diplomatic option. I'm going to send Condoleezza Rice to Jerusalem. You'll hold a press conference with her. You'll reveal the existence of this reactor to the world. We'll take it to the IAEA. We'll take it to the Security Council. We'll hit them with sanctions. We'll demand it be dismantled. And then if they don't do it, we always reserve the right to attack. And Olmert on that call says to George W. Bush, "This is unacceptable, Mr. President." And goes on to basically lecture him of how I, as the Prime Minister of Israel, carry the burden of the survival of the Jewish people on my shoulders. And if you will not attack, I will attack. And then the conversation ends, okay. Bush puts down the phone, and Steve Hadley, who was on the call listening on the American side, as well as Elliot Abrams, who was Steve Hadley's deputy national security advisor, was also on the call. Both of them were very nervous that Bush was going to blow up at this chutzpah by the Israeli prime minister. I mean, again, the superpower and little Israel. And instead, Bush puts down the call and says, "Wow, that pretty much along the lines of that guy's got guts," right? Said a little differently, but that was the way he ended that call. Now, fast forward a few months to September of 2007, and I think this story has always stuck with me when I think of the conversations that they had. So Israel attacks on September 6, 2007, just after midnight. The attack is not like the one in Iraq. It's not as far away. It's not as complicated. It's over the border. It's impressive, but it's not a crazy operation of itself. But it's a success. The planes land back. Israel waits to see if Assad's going to attack and war will break out. Thankfully, it doesn't. And Olmert figures now's the time to call up Bush. Bush at the time was in Australia attending the meeting of APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. And it takes a while till the White House can connect him on a secure line. He's in Sydney. Finally, they get him on the phone. Olmert says to the president, "Mr. President, how's Sydney? Great weather. How's it going down there?" And the president says, "Good, but we're not here to talk about the weather." And Olmert says, "Do you remember?" He was being careful. He didn't want to reveal too many details. He didn't know who might be listening. "Do you remember that thing up north that bothered us?" The president said, "Yes." So Olmert said, "I want you to know it no longer exists." And Bush said, "Oh, that's very interesting. Do you expect a response?" And Olmert said back to him, "For the time being, it does not look like there will be a response." And he was certain that would be the end of the call. President's busy. Sydney, Australia's got more important things to do. It was just a quick update. And Bush surprised him and said to him, "I want you to know that if there will be a response, all of America will stand behind you." And when I heard of this call, and it was then later confirmed for me by other people, to me, what really grabbed my attention was the fact this was a phone call that had never been published. No one knew about it. It was one of many phone calls that take place between Israeli prime ministers and presidents, although for the last month there hasn't been a phone call between an American president and an Israeli prime minister. But we'll put that aside for another time. But it was just one call, but look at what it carried with it, the significance, right? Here's an Israeli prime minister who just takes action from a place of vulnerability, does not know how it will end, does not know if war is going to break out, and gets told by the most powerful country in the world, by the leader of that country, I stand behind you. That shows something about the resilience of this relationship between Israel and the United States. By the way, like I mentioned before, they disagreed. Bush did not agree with what Olmert wanted to do. Bush wanted a diplomatic option. Olmert went with the military option. And despite that, you see the resilience and the strength of this alliance.
Wow, it's very it's impressive, and I think it also poses questions about future subsequent relations between other presidents and prime ministers. In the book, you talk about you draw some comparison with the debate in the Israeli government of 2010 about whether to attack Iran. And obviously, this is the subsequent government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Ehud Barak is the defense minister. Do you think that if relations had been better between Washington and Israel at that point, that it would have been a different scenario? Because obviously, it would be fair to say the relationship between the Netanyahu government and the Obama administration were not the same as the Olmert-Bush relationship.
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. Right. I think that one of the important elements of the story of Syria in 2007 was the fact that there was this close relationship between Bush and Olmert, and that played an important role here. There were parts of the administration, particularly Bob Gates, and I tell the story in the book, who comes to Bush and says, "You can't let Olmert do this. Right? You have to stop him. You can't let the Israelis lead us and tell us, and decide what they're going to do on their own." And Bush refused to do that, and that took a guts. While Bush might have been wrong, if I were to look back and think about his decision not to attack, but at least he understood that you can't stop the Israelis. One thing that I just will say about Netanyahu and Obama was it's hard for me to see how the hostility in that relationship benefited Israel, right? And I think that one of the things that we see today, if we look at what's happening right now with another Democratic administration now in power, in office, considering returning to the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, or trying to negotiate a different variant of that deal, and to already come out with very aggressively, I think, like the chief of staff did recently, Aviv Kochavi, against that deal, without giving an opportunity to try to work with the administration and see if we can maybe influence the process that is taking place, in my opinion, is a mistake, right? And I think that that might have been one of the mistakes that happened back in 2014, 2015. Now, it's hard for me to tell you, though, would the Obama administration have been willing to give Israel a seat at the table? It's possible they wouldn't have, because, as we know, famously, Obama wanted to create daylight between the United States and Israel at the time. So that was maybe different. But I think that now, if we apply all of these models, 81, 2007, 2015, to where we are today in 2021, I think that the most important step for us to take today is to try to influence this process, try to play ball with the Biden administration, try to steer it in a way where it would be to our benefit before we start the saber rattling.
Okay, thank you very much. Herzl, there are a couple of questions which I want to put to you. One is a very simple question, which is, and I don't know if you want to have a go at answering this, but what would Begin have done in relation to Iran today?
Well, I usually tend to say that I don't know what Begin would have done, because he was a man who thought, had his own view of the world, and of course circumstances are different, so I can't speculate. I can tell you what I told you, what was his principles, what he said, not what he would say. I believe that the doctrine that he put on the table, and which in a way was in front of Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and was in front of Prime Minister Netanyahu when he made the decision or tried to be ready. That doctrine was in front of them and was the inspiration for them as well. But the whole situation with Iran is very different from what we had in 81 in Iraq. It's a completely different circumstances and strategic aims and different kind of weapons. Everything is different. If I just may, I want to make just one comment about the previous question.
Please.
Personally, I think that good relations between leaders is important and it's nice to have, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is the interest that each leader see for his state, his country, and the ideology, if you want. By the way, Begin was asked, why didn't you tell the Americans that we are going to do it? So he said, I was going to do it. And I didn't want to do it after asking them, and they would say no. And I think that during the Obama administration, vice versus Netanyahu government here, the whole world view was different.
Right.
So they couldn't come to a common ground. Yeah, we upset them here, they upset us there, but the gap wasn't because they didn't like each other. Maybe they didn't like each other because of the gap of in viewing the situation in the region and what should be the policy of the United States and Israel at that time.
Right. I mean, just as an aside, I don't want to spend too long on this, but as you're here, the prime minister that you worked for, Yitzhak Shamir, had a famously frosty relationship with George Bush Sr., right?
That's true. And many times, by the way, Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, used to say to Yitzhak Shamir, you think that I am tough. If you would go and speak to my boss, you would get much worse.
Yaakov, here's a question which maybe you can answer based on your, not just the research that you've done around Syria, around the Syria issue, but also Iran and your time as a military reporter. The question is, was there ever a time in the past years when such a blow could have been struck at Iran? Or is it like now we know we've heard all about how it's so much more difficult than Syria or Iraq, as Herzl said. The nuclear facilities are dispersed around the country, they're underground. Was there a point when we could have struck militarily and we just missed the chance?
I don't think we missed the chance. I think we made a decision not to do it, right? There were two opportunities or two times when the attack option was placed on the table in a serious way. One was in 2010 and again in 2012. In 2010, and what's now known as quite a famous story, the Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time and Defense Minister Ehud Barak at the time asked the IDF to begin preparations for a military strike at the end of a security cabinet meeting that was taking place at the Mossad headquarters just north of Tel Aviv. And both the chief of staff, who was then Gabi Ashkenazi, currently Israel's foreign minister, as well as Meir Dagan, who was then the head of the Mossad, the late Meir Dagan, were very much opposed to attacking at the time. And without their support, the prime minister had to basically step down. In 2012, they did not have the support of the security cabinet. And if in 2010 he might have been able to convince members of the security cabinet, in 2012 he can no longer convince members of the security cabinet. So that's just part of the checks and balances in the country. But also then it seemed that the prime minister was very serious of launching a strike against Iran. I think that when it comes to Iran, what has always been the working assumption in Israel is that the Air Force primarily, which would probably carry the greatest load in such a strike or attack, play the biggest role, would be able to carry it out and cause Saddam back Iran's nuclear program for a period of time, right? Like Herzl had mentioned, Iran is a different animal, right? Yes, it's a nuclear program, but if Osirak was one facility above ground, if Al-Kibar, the nuclear reactor in Syria, was one facility above ground, the Iranians have learned their lesson from these two experiences and have scattered their facilities around the country. And some of them have been built deep underground, like in Natanz or Qom, Fordo, the facility near Qom. So this is a different operation. With that said, the Air Force does believe it has the capability to destroy enough and damage enough to set back the Iranians and cause them enough damage. But the Iranians are very advanced in their program today. They have the technical know-how, right? We saw the recent assassination in November of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the top nuclear scientist, which, while a blow to Iran's continued development of a nuclear program, that's not what's going to stop them if they want to continue to advance. So I think that it's not a question necessarily of capability. It's more a question of readiness and the ability to make that tough decision to do it. And when is the right time to make that decision?
Right. And of course, the response, there's no possibility that Iran could pretend not to know about it as Syria did. And there's no possibility, as was the case with Iraq, that there was no capacity for response, right? Because Iran can respond through Hezbollah and other means, right?
For sure. And I think, Hezbollah today, with its 100,000 plus rockets and missiles that cover the state of Israel, Iran, which is believed within the IDF today, this is from what I hear recently, has close to 1,000 missiles capable of reaching the state of Israel today. This is a lot to cause us damage. But so the question really comes down to, and I think that, what Begin did, which later became known as the Begging Doctrine, and then what Olmert did in mind, and further solidifying this doctrine as something that we will continue. The question is, when is that point with Iran, right? So if tomorrow the Iranians, we find out that Iran is now enriching uranium to 90% levels, which is military grade, has assembled the weapons team, they're building the bomb, and it's a matter of weeks or months, I believe that Israel, no matter who the prime minister is, will have, I take that back. There may be some people who won't, but this prime minister would have no choice but to take some action, right? But as long as that's not happening, then you will want to keep off and stave off that war that's going to come, and because it's going to be a bad war. And you want to try to prevent that for as long as possible and hope that there's some other solution. I think that that's what Israel has done responsibly until now, right? A strike should be the last resort, but it should always be on the table. Thank you,
Yaakov. I think we're gonna close. Herzl, do you have some closing words for our audience, especially as we're commemorating Menachem Begin and thinking about his contribution to the state of Israel, and perhaps particularly in this event, his contribution to Israel's security?
I believe that the contribution of Menachem Begin to the state of Israel is much beyond the decision, which was a historic decision, to attack the nuclear reactor in Iraq. because Begin changed the Israeli geostrategic situation by signing the peace with Egypt. That for sure contributes tremendously to the situation of the state of Israel. And Menachem Begin reshaped Israel's society in many ways, which I won't go into it. So I believe that the fact that Menachem Begin is the most quoted and the most present prime minister, late prime minister, in the public arena of Israel today, it's due to the fact that he really reshaped Israel. David Ben-Gurion shaped Israel in 1948 as the first prime minister of the state of Israel. Begin, during his term of 6 years, reshaped Israel in every aspect of the state life. And because of that, and because of the model of leadership that we can learn from him, I believe that he should be learned and be an inspiration for current generation of leaders and the next generation of leaders as well.
Thank you, Herzl. And I think we all concur. And as Yaakov intimated at the beginning, I think as we contemplate another set of elections, we can we should only hope and pray for leaders that come close to Begin's stature and abilities and integrity. I want to thank Jakob Katz and Herzl Makov very much for this fantastic evening and exposition of their experiences and their wisdom. I also heartily commend Yaakov's book, Shadow Strike, available on Amazon and Book Depository and good bookstores everywhere. And I thank you all and have a great evening and a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good evening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.